The warm rays of the afternoon sun bathed the quiet suburban street in a golden glow. It was the kind of day when everything seemed perfectly ordinary. The kind of day you would expect to end with a peaceful evening, the faint scent of freshly mowed lawns lingering in the air. Birds chirped in the distance, and the sound of a lawnmower hummed faintly down the block, adding to the idyllic atmosphere. It was the sort of neighborhood where neighbors waved at one another and kids rode their bikes down the street without a care in the world. Everything about this scene was serene, as if the world was in perfect harmony. But as I wheeled Grace toward our driveway, the peace seemed more like an illusion than reality. Grace, my disabled daughter, struggled with her wheelchair, her hands gripping the armrests as she maneuvered the difficult terrain of the driveway. Despite her struggles, there was a determination in her eyes. She had come a long way, but her body, limited by her disability, still posed daily challenges. I could hear her soft breath, steady yet filled with the tension that always came with her trying to get out of the car. I stood close behind her, guiding the chair with careful hands. It wasn't easy, but it was something we had become used to. Together, we managed. This was supposed to be a simple, quiet moment, a peaceful afternoon in our home. And yet, something fell off. There was an unsettling feeling in the air, a sense that things weren't quite as they seemed. As Grace finally made it onto the sidewalk, the sound of footsteps on the pavement caught my attention. I turned just in time to see the woman from next door, Karen, standing on her porch, glaring at us from across the street. Her arms were crossed tightly, her expression cold and dismissive. The usual friendly face of a neighborhood had vanished, replaced by the sharpness of her disapproval. She stood there, seething, as if waiting for the slightest mistake, the smallest opportunity to unleash whatever was simmering under the surface. The sun hit her in such a way that her features seemed almost harsh, the furrow of her brow, the rigid set of her jaw. It was all too clear. This was not the friendly neighbor who waved when we passed by. This was someone who had already made her judgment, someone who wasn't about to let the peace of the neighborhood stand in her way. I could feel the tension rise as I steadied Grace, now in the front yard, and looked back toward Karen. Her eyes locked onto us, filled with barely concealed contempt. It was as if she was waiting for us to cross some invisible line. I couldn't quite explain why, but I could tell that something was about to happen. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees was the only thing that seemed to be in sync with the calm of the neighborhood, but even that was eerily subdued, as if the air itself was holding its breath. And just like that, the calm before the storm enveloped us. The world was still, the moment held, but the storm was coming, and we could feel it. I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease as Grace continued down the driveway. Her wheelchair had always drawn stares from those who weren't familiar with the realities of disability, but Karen's reaction felt different. This wasn't the look of casual curiosity, this was something more. It was disdain. It was judgment. She couldn't help herself. She had to ruin our peace, I thought to myself. The words echoed in my mind as I realized the nature of Karen's gaze. It wasn't just the disapproval of a neighbor. It was the kind of look that said we were an inconvenience. We were an eyesore in the perfect little neighborhood she imagined. I had seen this look before, but never quite so intensely. Grace, unaware of the tension building, continued to struggle with her chair. She wasn't bothered by Karen's glare. She was too focused on the task at hand. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this quiet moment, this simple act of returning home, had already been tainted by something much darker. As I guided Grace into the house, I could feel the weight of Karen's stare still on us, pressing down like a storm cloud ready to burst. The tranquility of the neighborhood, the normalcy of the day, all seemed to fade as the storm loomed on the horizon. We had no idea what was about to happen, but we knew one thing for sure. Nothing would ever be the same again. The air outside had grown heavy, and the once peaceful neighborhood now felt like a ticking time bomb. The weight of Karen's gaze still lingered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to explode. Grace, oblivious to the storm that was brewing, was inside the house now, taking off her jacket and resting for a moment. I decided to step outside to keep an eye on things, to keep the peace. But as I stepped out onto the porch, I saw Karen again, this time standing at the edge of her driveway, her arms crossed over her chest. The look on her face was unmistakable, a mix of contempt and something darker, more volatile. She was seething with barely contained frustration. And she was waiting for something. I approached, my instincts already on high alert. The stillness of the street seemed almost surreal, the hum of the lawnmower distant. But in the pit of my stomach, I knew this moment would change everything. Before I could say anything, Karen's voice cut through the air, harsh and demanding. "Excuse me," she called out, her tone dripping with disdain. "You think it's acceptable to park that thing so close to my driveway? How am I supposed to get in and out with that obstacle there? It's a complete inconvenience." Her words were sharp, each one landing like a slap in the face. I could feel the blood rush to my head, but I kept my voice calm, measured, despite the rising anger within me. Grace had enough to contend with every day, and now Karen was making it worse, picking on her for something she couldn't control. "She's just parking here, Karen," I said, trying to keep my tone even. "We're not blocking your driveway." "Not blocking." Karen's voice rose with each word, and her face reddened. "Look at this. You've parked right on the edge. It's inconsiderate and dangerous. What if someone needs to use this space? You people think you're above everyone else, don't you?" I could see Grace watching from the doorway, her eyes wide. Her hands gripped the doorframe, a sign that she was already feeling the tension. I didn't want her to see this, didn't want her to hear the words Karen was throwing at her, but she could feel it too, the hostility in the air. The anger started to bubble up inside me, but I held it in check. I couldn't afford to lose control. Not here, not in front of Grace. "Karen, it's just a parking spot," I said, trying to reason. "No one is blocking you, and no one is making things difficult. Let's just go inside and forget this." "You think I'm just going to let this go?" Karen sneered, taking a few steps forward, her face twisted with disdain. "I'm done being polite. You and your family think you can come into this neighborhood and do whatever you want. You have no respect for anyone, do you?" Her words were venomous, each sentence loaded with more judgment. It was clear she wasn't interested in talking things out. She was looking for a fight, and I knew that no matter how calm I remained, there was no stopping her now. "Karen, just stop," I said, trying to get her to see reason. "This isn't the time for this. It's a simple mistake." But Karen wasn't listening. She was already too far gone, her frustration boiling over. She moved closer, stepping onto the sidewalk, practically standing on the very edge of the driveway. "No, you listen to me," she hissed. "I've had enough of you, and I'm not going to sit by while you ruin everything in this neighborhood." I could see the malice in her eyes, the venom that seemed to drip from every word. I could feel the tension rising with every second, and before I could process what was happening, she did something I never expected. Without warning, she raised her hand and slapped Grace across the face. The sound of the slap rang out like a thunderclap, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. My heart dropped in my chest, and my blood ran cold. I looked at Grace, her wide eyes filled with shock as the sting of the slap began to register. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. But the primal urge to protect my daughter kicked in, and before I knew it, I was standing between Grace and Karen, my body shaking with fury. "Don't you ever lay a hand on her again." I roared, my voice shaking with the intensity of the moment. My fists clenched at my sides, and I could feel the heat rising in my chest, the anger threatening to spill over. Karen took a step back, her eyes wide with surprise, but there was no apology in her expression, no regret. Instead, there was defiance. "You can't intimidate me," she snapped, her voice still full of venom. "You think you're special just because of who you are? You're not." I didn't have time to process her words. My mind was consumed with one thought. Protect Grace. Protect her from this woman who had crossed a line she should never have crossed. "You don't know who you're messing with," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "I'm the FBI director." And this is far from over. The air seemed to hang heavier now, thick with the weight of what had just happened. Grace stood frozen behind me, her body stiff, her face pale from the shock. The sting of Karen's slap was still reverberating through the air, and I could feel the pulse of my own anger coursing through my veins. I wasn't sure what had happened. One moment everything was calm, and the next I was standing between Karen and my daughter, ready to explode. Karen, though momentarily taken aback, quickly recovered. Her eyes, wide with a strange mixture of surprise and determination, narrowed again. She was unshaken. For a moment, I saw the true nature of the woman standing in front of me, the person who was so consumed by her sense of superiority and entitlement that she thought she could act without consequence. I could see Grace, still holding onto the doorframe, the look of bewilderment etched across her face. She hadn't moved since the slap, her eyes wide and glassy, as if she couldn't quite process what had just happened. I could feel her fear in the way her hands gripped the edge of the door. I knew she was scared, but what terrified me more was how vulnerable she had become in that one fleeting moment. "Grace, it's okay," I said, trying to steady my voice, but I could feel the tremor in it. "Don't worry, I'm here." But I wasn't entirely sure if I believed my own words. I couldn't undo what had just happened. I couldn't take away the sting of the slap, nor could I erase the emotional damage it had caused. My daughter, who had already fought so hard to navigate a world that wasn't designed for her, had just been assaulted in front of me. And I was furious. Karen stood there, watching us like a predator watching its prey. She was clearly not intimidated by me, not in the least. In fact, I could see the twisted satisfaction growing in her eyes. The shock of the slap was still fresh, but her face had turned into one of cold defiance. "You're not going to do anything about it," she said, her voice dripping with contempt. "You can't even control your own daughter. How are you supposed to control anything else?" Her words hit me like a physical blow. It took everything I had not to retaliate right then and there, but I knew that would only make things worse. I was the FBI director. I had to think before I acted, no matter how much my anger pushed me to lash out. But this wasn't just about me. This was about Grace, my daughter, the person who depended on me. And I wasn't about to let her go through something like this, not without consequences, not without making sure this woman, this HOA, Karen, understood that what she had done was not just unacceptable, it was criminal. I turned to Grace, trying to shield her from the sight of Karen, but I could see the hurt in her eyes. "Grace, we're going to take care of this, okay?" I said, though I wasn't sure how much reassurance my words really offered. I felt the familiar weight of responsibility on my shoulders. It was a feeling I had dealt with for years, the weight of being the protector, the provider, the one who had to keep everything together. And now, more than ever, I knew that this was no ordinary situation. With a deep breath, I stepped forward, closing the space between me and Karen. My voice was steady now, cold and calculated. "You made a mistake today," I said, my words cutting through the tension. "But I don't think you understand the magnitude of what you've done. This isn't just about a parking spot. This is about my daughter. And you're going to regret what you've done." Karen's smile was thin and cruel. She crossed her arms, unfazed by my threat. "You're just a guy in a suit playing pretend. What can you do?" She taunted, her voice rising in pitch, dripping with venom. The sheer arrogance in her voice made my blood boil, but I stayed focused. "You may think I'm just a man in a suit, but I don't need a badge to know right from wrong," I said, "and what you did is wrong. Very wrong." I could feel Grace's eyes on me, though I didn't turn to look. I could feel the fear radiating off her, the lingering shock from the slap. It tore at me, knowing that she was caught in this mess because of something I couldn't control. "Call the cops," Karen sneered, clearly enjoying the chaos she had stirred up. "But don't expect me to care. You can't win this fight. Not against me." Her words were taunts, but they did nothing to sway me. I knew what had to be done. I knew how the law worked, and I knew exactly how far I could take this. "You don't understand," I said, the calm in my voice belying the storm brewing inside me. This is not just about me. I'm not some ordinary guy. I'm the FBI director. And you have just made a very big mistake. The moment the words left my mouth, I could see the shift in Karen's expression. The arrogance faded, replaced by the first hint of doubt. She had no idea who she was dealing with, and the realization was dawning on her too late. I turned to Grace, who was still frozen by the door. We're going to make sure she never hurts anyone else again, I said, my voice filled with certainty. No one messes with my family. And with that, the storm that had been brewing for so long finally broke loose. The realization of Karen's ignorance about who I really was hit her hard. But I wasn't about to let her off the hook just because she was playing the role of the ignorant neighbor. She had crossed a line, and the consequences would be severe. My mind raced as I turned back to face Grace, who was still standing by the door, her eyes wide with shock and confusion. I could see the fear in her expression, and that alone sent a surge of determination through me. I had spent years working with people who thought they were above the law, who believed they could get away with anything simply because of their position, wealth, or entitlement. Karen was no different. She thought she could intimidate us, bully us into submission, and ruin our peace without any consequence. She was wrong. She didn't know the first thing about what it meant to challenge someone like me. I was the FBI director, and I didn't take threats or violence lightly. Grace, I said, my voice calm but firm, stay here and lock the door. Don't come out until I say so. I could see the hesitation in her eyes, but she nodded slowly, stepping back into the house and closing the door behind her. I could hear the click of the lock as she did, a small reassurance that at least she was safe for the moment. As I turned back to Karen, the fire inside me burned hotter than ever. I knew what had to be done. This wasn't just about justice anymore. This was about protecting my family, making sure that no one, not even someone as insignificant as Karen, could violate our space, our home, and our peace. I wasn't going to stand by and let her think she could get away with it. I pulled out my phone, dialing the number of a trusted colleague at the local police department. As I waited for the call to connect, I kept my eyes locked on Karen. Her smug smile had faltered, but she wasn't backing down. She thought she still had the upper hand, but she didn't know what was coming. Detective Ramirez, this is FBI Director, your full name, I said as soon as the call picked up. I need you to send an officer to my address immediately. We have an assault case involving a neighbor. I need this handled right away. No delays. And, Detective, make sure you have a record of everything. I'll be in touch personally. I could hear the shock in his voice, but I didn't wait for him to respond. I hung up the phone and turned my attention back to Karen, who was now pacing in her driveway, clearly trying to regain some semblance of control. She was testing me. She was waiting for me to back down, for me to let the situation slip into some kind of half-hearted resolution. But I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. I wasn't some ordinary parent. I had spent my entire career making sure the law was upheld, making sure that those who believe themselves untouchable paid for their actions. And Karen would be no exception. I told you this wasn't over, I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a knife. You've made a serious mistake, Karen, and I'm not going to let you get away with it. Karen stopped pacing and turned toward me, her face hardening into a mask of defiance. She crossed her arms, her stance indicating she was ready for whatever came next. But I could see the flicker of doubt in her eyes now. The cocky confidence she had carried earlier was gone. She knew, deep down, that she was in over her head. What are you going to do? Huh? Call the cops. Karen scoffed, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Do you really think they'll take you seriously? You can't intimidate me, not with your badge and your suit. Her words only fueled my determination. She didn't understand that this wasn't about intimidation. This was about doing what was right. I wasn't the one who had crossed the line. She was. She had slapped my daughter, humiliated her, and thought there would be no consequences. Now she was going to learn what happens when you make the wrong enemy. Maybe you don't get it yet, I said, my voice lower now, almost a whisper, but you're about to see. just how far I'm willing to go to make sure you pay for what you've done. Karen opened her mouth to retort, but before she could speak, I heard the sound of a car pulling up to the curb. I turned toward the street, and sure enough, a police car had arrived. Detective Ramirez was stepping out of the vehicle, followed by two officers, all of them walking toward us with an air of professionalism that was unmistakable. Karen's face drained of color. She hadn't expected this. The shock was evident as she looked from me to the officers, realizing that this was no longer just a petty argument between neighbors. This was something much bigger. "You're under arrest for assault," Detective Ramirez said, his tone firm as he stepped up to Karen, handcuffs ready. "You have the right to remain silent." Karen stood frozen for a moment, her mouth opening and closing as if she were trying to process what was happening. Her eyes darted between the officers and me, the reality of her situation finally sinking in. "You can't do this," she shouted, trying to pull away, but the officers held firm. "I can," I said, stepping closer, my voice steady, "and I will. You've hurt my daughter, and now you're going to answer for it." The officers led her away, but not before she shot one last look at me, one that was filled with a mixture of fear, disbelief, and maybe even regret. As she was placed in the back of the squad car, I felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about a slap anymore. This was about standing up for my family, about making sure Grace knew that she would always be protected, no matter the cost. And as the car pulled away, I knew this was only the beginning of what would be a long, hard fight. But I was ready for it, ready to do whatever it took to make sure Grace and I came out on top. The evening was quiet, but the tension still hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. The police had taken Karen away, and the officers were still at the house, taking statements and gathering evidence. I stood in the living room, my arms crossed, my mind racing. I had never imagined that something like this could happen, but here we were, dealing with the aftermath of Karen's violent outburst. Grace was sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes distant as she stared at the floor. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her that everything would be okay, but the truth was, I didn't know if it would be. I didn't know how much damage had been done, emotionally and physically. I walked over and sat beside her, trying to hide my own fear. She looked up at me, her face pale, her eyes wide. "Dad, why did she do that?" Grace asked in a small, trembling voice. My heart broke for her. How could I explain the inexplicable? How could I tell her that there were people in this world who could be so cruel, so filled with hatred and judgment, that they would lash out at a disabled child for no reason at all? "I don't know, sweetie," I said softly, my voice strained. "But what I do know is that we're going to make sure she never does anything like this to anyone else again. You're safe now, Grace." But even as I spoke those words, I couldn't help but wonder, how would she heal from this? How would I heal from this? Karen had crossed a line that I couldn't just ignore. This wasn't just a neighborhood dispute. This was assault, and I was determined to make sure that Karen paid for what she had done. As the officers finished up, Detective Ramirez came inside, his face grim. "We've got everything we need from a scene. The evidence is clear. She slapped your daughter, and we've got witnesses to back it up." I nodded, but a part of me still felt unsettled. This was far from over. "What's next?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "We'll be pressing charges," Ramirez replied. "This isn't just about the slap. From what we've gathered, Karen has a history of antagonizing her neighbors, causing trouble, and acting out in violent ways when things don't go her way. This is just the latest incident in a long line of complaints. We'll make sure this time she faces the consequences of her actions." I felt a weight lift off my chest, but only slightly. The fight wasn't over yet. It had just begun. "We'll keep you updated on everything," Ramirez continued. "But I think it's safe to say that Karen is in deep trouble. She won't be getting off easy." "Good," I said, my voice cold. "She doesn't deserve to." As Ramirez and the officers left, I turned back to Grace. She was still sitting on the couch, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of the blanket. I sat down beside her again, taking her hand in mine. I'm going to make sure she never hurts anyone again. I told her, my voice firm. You don't have to worry about her anymore. You're safe. But even as I said the words, a nagging thought lingered in the back of my mind. Karen's slap was just the surface of something much deeper. I could feel it, a darkness, an anger, a history of cruelty that went beyond this one incident. And I knew that the more we dug into her past, the more we would uncover. This wasn't just about a slap anymore. It was about exposing the kind of person Karen truly was, and making sure she never had the chance to hurt anyone again. As the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something more was coming. I had only scratched the surface of Karen's history, but I was determined to uncover the full extent of her actions. And when the truth came out, it was going to shake this neighborhood to its core. For now, I could only focus on Grace, on making sure she felt safe, on making sure she knew that no one, not even someone like Karen, would ever be allowed to hurt her again. But in the back of my mind, I was already preparing for what lay ahead. The investigation was just beginning, and I knew that it was going to get much worse before it got better. But I was ready, ready to fight for my daughter, ready to make sure Karen faced the full consequences of her actions. No one was going to get away with this, not while I was standing in her way. The following days felt like a blur of legal jargon, police reports, and interviews. The neighborhood, once so calm and friendly, was now filled with whispers and murmurs. Karen's slap was the talk of the town, and I could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on me. But it wasn't just the slap that haunted me, it was everything that came after. As I sat in my office, going over the case files with Detective Ramirez, I knew there was more to Karen's story than what we had seen on that fateful afternoon. There had to be. People like her didn't just lash out for no reason. And the more I dug into her background, the more I realized that the violence she had shown toward Grace wasn't an isolated incident. We've dug up some interesting stuff, Ramirez said, his voice tense as he flipped through the pages. It's not just the slap. We've got a history here. A long one. I leaned in, narrowing my eyes. What do you mean? He slid a folder across the desk to me. Inside were police reports, court documents, and statements from various neighbors. Each one painted a picture of a woman who had built a reputation for herself over the years. A reputation that wasn't as pristine as the front she put on for the neighborhood. Karen has been involved in multiple incidents before this one, Ramirez said, pointing to the papers. From verbal abuse to threats of violence. She's had run-ins with neighbors, especially those who've dared to stand up to her. And the worst part? This behavior goes all the way back to when she first moved in here. I sifted through the reports, my heart sinking as I read about Karen's previous confrontations. One particular incident stood out. A neighbor who had filed a restraining order after Karen had physically attacked her dog for being too close to her yard. Another neighbor had been threatened after attempting to call her out for repeatedly parking in front of their driveway. But what made my blood run cold was the chilling pattern in the reports. Each time Karen was confronted, she escalated, never backing down, always blaming others for her actions. This is bad, I muttered, clenching the folder in my hands. How is this just now coming to light? Ramirez's gaze darkened. It's not easy to pin down someone like Karen. She's manipulative, and she knows how to play the system. The neighbors are too afraid to speak up until something major happens. That's how we ended up here. I took a deep breath, my fist tightening. The realization hit me hard. Karen wasn't just a rude neighbor or a difficult person. She was a bully, a woman who had been hiding behind her smile for far too long. And now she had gone too far. She had hurt Grace. She had crossed the line. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about one woman's outburst. This was about a culture of fear that had allowed her to get away with it for years. It was about a system that had failed to see her for what she truly was, a danger to everyone around her. I looked up from the documents and met Ramirez's gaze. We need to make sure this isn't just swept under the rug. Karen's going to face the consequences of all of this, not just for what she did to Grace, but for everything she's done to those people. He nodded, his face grim. We're going to make sure she's held accountable. and we'll need to gather more statements, get a full picture of what she's done. But I agree she needs to be stopped. As the conversation continued, I couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility weighing on me. Grace had been the one to suffer physically, but there were so many others who had suffered in silence for years, too afraid to speak out. I was in a position of power, and I wasn't going to let that power go to waste. That night, as I sat with Grace in the living room, I could feel the tension between us. She was quieter than usual, her eyes still haunted by the slap. I hated seeing her like this, and I wished more than anything that I could take the pain away, but I couldn't. What I could do was ensure that Karen would never be able to hurt her or anyone else again. We're going to make sure she can't hurt anyone anymore, I said softly, turning to Grace. You have my word. She looked up at me, her expression a mixture of relief and uncertainty. But what happens now? What happens to her? She's going to pay for what she's done, I said firmly. And we're going to make sure she never hurts anyone again. Grace nodded, but I could see the lingering fear in her eyes. I knew that this would take time, and that there were still many challenges ahead. But I was determined to see this through. Karen had shown her true colors, and it was time for the world to see them too. The darkness that had hung over this neighborhood for so long was about to be exposed, and I was going to make sure that the truth came to light no matter what it took. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. What had started as a simple neighborhood dispute had morphed into something much larger. The media had caught wind of the story, and soon Karen was not just the HOA Karen. She was a symbol of everything wrong with communities that allowed people like her to fester in silence. The once calm street, filled with friendly neighbors and quiet evenings, was now the scene of constant media attention. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had something to say. But amidst the chaos, the one thing that kept me grounded was my family. Grace, despite her fear and trauma, had shown an incredible amount of resilience. She was determined not to let this define her. Though I could see the lingering scars, the way she flinched at sudden movements or loud noises. But every day, she was getting stronger. As for me, I threw myself into the fight. I wasn't just the FBI director in this moment. I was a father determined to make sure his daughter was safe and that no one else would ever have to face the kind of cruelty Karen had shown. But the fight for justice wasn't just in the courts. It was in every word I spoke, every action I took. It was a fight for Grace's dignity, for her sense of security, and for her future. One night, as we sat together at the dinner table, I could see Grace's reluctance to eat. She poked at her food, absent-mindedly, lost in her thoughts. I knew she had been struggling with the media attention, with the constant questions and the curious stares. But I also knew she needed to feel like things were normal again. So I reached across the table, gently taking her hand. "How are you feeling, Grace?" I asked softly. She met my eyes, her expression still distant, but no longer filled with fear. "I'm okay, Dad," she said, her voice steady, though I could tell she was still processing everything. "It's just hard. Everything's hard." I nodded, understanding her pain more than words could express. "I know, sweetheart. It's not easy, but you're strong. You've been through a lot, and you've come so far. You're going to come out of this even stronger. I promise." Grace smiled faintly, squeezing my hand. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again." I felt a lump form in my throat. I had always prided myself on being strong for my family, on being the one who could protect them from harm. But this was something I couldn't fully protect her from. The damage had already been done. But I could fight to make sure Karen could never hurt her again. "You will feel safe again," I said, my voice firm with resolve. "I won't stop until you do. I'll make sure of it." And that was the truth. The legal proceedings were moving forward, and it seemed clear that Karen would face serious charges. The evidence of her violent tendencies was stacking up, from the slap that had set everything in motion to the long list of incidents in her past that had gone unnoticed for far too long. It was clear that her reign of terror in this neighborhood was about to end, But despite the mounting evidence, I knew it wouldn't be easy. Karen was stubborn, and she wasn't about to go down without a fight. She had already begun her campaign to discredit me, painting herself as the victim, claiming that her actions were misunderstood, that Grace had provoked her. It was the same old song, deflecting blame, refusing to take responsibility. But this time it wouldn't work. I wasn't about to let Karen twist the narrative. Not when it came to Grace. Not when it came to the truth. The day of the court hearing finally arrived. The courtroom was packed with reporters, neighbors, and onlookers, all eager to witness the drama unfold. The tension in the air was palpable. Grace was sitting beside me, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes focused on the proceedings. She was nervous, but I could see the strength in her, the quiet resolve to face the woman who had hurt her, to stand tall and make sure this was the end of Karen's cruelty. The trial was intense. The prosecutor presented evidence of Karen's past behavior, the previous threats, the incidents of violence, and the pattern of escalating aggression. It was damning. The defense tried to argue that Karen had been provoked, that she had acted out of frustration, but there was no denying the truth. Karen's actions were unprovoked, unjustifiable, and harmful. As the trial went on, I found myself becoming more and more consumed by the fight. It wasn't just about the legal case anymore. It was personal. This was about protecting Grace, about making sure Karen never had the opportunity to hurt anyone else. But more than that, it was about standing up to the kind of person who thought they could get away with anything. Karen's sense of entitlement had blinded her to the fact that actions have consequences, and it was time for her to face those consequences. When the verdict finally came, it was clear. Karen was found guilty on all charges. The judge's words were firm, condemning her actions and making it clear that she would not be allowed to continue terrorizing the neighborhood. The relief that washed over me was immediate, but it wasn't just about the legal victory. It was about knowing that Grace, my daughter, was safe, that this nightmare was finally over. As we left the courthouse, Grace looked up at me, her eyes a little brighter than before. "Dad, we did it," she said quietly. "We did," I replied, my heart swelling with pride. "We did." But even as I said those words, I knew that the road to healing was far from over. It would take time for Grace to fully recover from what had happened. But I was confident that with time and support, she would heal, and I would be right there beside her every step of the way. Karen had been stopped, justice had been served, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like we could finally breathe. The days following the trial were quieter, though still filled with a sense of unease. The neighborhood had started to return to some semblance of normalcy, but it wasn't the same. The streets no longer felt as safe, and there was still an underlying tension that lingered in the air. But for Grace and me, things had changed. We were no longer victims of Karen's cruelty. And while the road ahead wasn't entirely clear, there was a sense of peace that started to settle in. We had spent weeks battling in court, and I had done everything I could to make sure Grace was protected, to make sure she felt safe again. But the real challenge, I knew, would come after the legal victory. The emotional scars from Karen's actions were something that would take time to heal. It wasn't enough to just put her away. It was about restoring the sense of security that Grace had lost. One afternoon after the verdict had been read, I found myself sitting on the porch, watching the world go by. Grace was inside, reading a book. I could hear the faint sounds of the neighborhood, the kids laughing, the distant hum of lawnmowers, but none of it felt quite the same. It felt almost tentative, like everyone was waiting for something else to happen. I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen's departure had only been the beginning. Just then, I saw a figure standing at the end of the driveway. It was Karen. I stood up immediately, a surge of anger and disbelief coursing through me. She was out of prison already? How was that possible? But as I walked toward her, I saw that her posture was different. She wasn't angry or defiant. She seemed defeated. Her once pristine clothes now looked disheveled, and the usual confidence that she had exuded was nowhere to be found. Instead, there was something else, a subtle vulnerability, a sense of loss. I didn't know what to say. After everything she'd done, after everything she had put Grace and me through, I had no sympathy for her. But I couldn't help but feel a sense of justice in her silence. She had lost. She had failed in her attempt to break us, and she knew it. "I'm here to apologize," Karen said, her voice soft, almost hesitant. I? I know I can't fix what I did. I can't undo the harm I've caused. But I need you to know, I'm sorry." I stood there for a long moment processing her words. A part of me wanted to tell her that her apology didn't matter, that nothing she said could take back the pain she had caused. But another part of me understood something deeper. This wasn't about forgiveness. This wasn't about her redemption. This was about her understanding that her actions had consequences. "You don't get to apologize and make everything better," I said, my voice steady but filled with the weight of everything that had happened. "You can't take back the damage you've done, but you can start by leaving us alone. That's the best thing you can do for us now." Her face hardened at my words, but there was no fight in her. She nodded slowly before turning and walking away, leaving me standing there, the finality of her departure settling in. As I watched her leave, I felt a deep sense of closure. It wasn't the kind of closure I had expected. Not a dramatic confrontation, not some grand gesture of redemption. It was just over. And that was enough. I returned to the house, and when I walked inside, I found Grace sitting at the kitchen table, her eyes still a little heavy from the emotional toll of the past few weeks. But as I approached her, I saw something different in her eyes, something I hadn't seen in a long time. "Hope, we're free now," I said, sitting down next to her. She smiled, a soft but genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Yeah, we are." It wasn't perfect. There were still wounds to heal, scars to mend. But as I sat there with Grace, knowing that we had both fought for this moment, I knew we were stronger for it. Karen's reign of terror had ended, and in its place was the possibility of peace. We had taken the first step toward healing, together, as the sun set on the horizon, casting a soft glow over the neighborhood. I knew that the fight was over. The storm had passed, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the weight of it all lift from my shoulders. Grace and I were going to be okay. The road ahead might still be long, but we would face it together. And that in itself was enough. As we close this chapter, I want to remind you that justice is not just about the law. It's about standing up for what's right, no matter the cost. If you've been inspired by this journey and want to see more stories of real people fighting for what they deserve, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Stay tuned for more gripping content, and remember, in the face of adversity, you are never alone. Join us for more powerful stories at HOA Denied Access. Don't miss out.